practice? You tell me.
It's just anything within the realm of your training and experience.
Yeah, everything in that book is going to be part of your scope of practice. Now that doesn't mean here in Massachusetts you're going to be allowed to do all of those things, but things defined as your scope of practice are you're exactly right. Things that you have been trained to do. There's been one fight after another with the computers here this morning. I got new equipment again, and they they think too highly of my computer abilities. I'll tell you that. So, as an EMT, what do you think your legal responsibilities are? What do you think your duties as an EMT really are?
Taking care of people.
Taking care of people, absolutely. So, let's get down to brass tacks a little bit here, and we'll talk about what we're legally allowed to do and what we're not supposed to do, and when, when you're actually even legally obligated to provide care as an EMT, because there are some times where those things are a little different. Um, Anything outside of that textbook, and this is kind of the real easy defining line, right? Anything outside of that textbook is typically considered to be outside of your scope of practice. State law actually will define and set up some differences as far as all that goes, but state law and the National Registry often run afoul of one another. This textbook is written to a national standard. What's that mean? What that means is it is written to be taught nationwide. Now, anybody that's lived in Massachusetts for more than 5 minutes knows that when they get the opportunity, the government and the people that make decisions here in the Commonwealth like to be different. So we do have a bit different scope of practice, and they do expect sometimes a bit of a different standard of care, and we'll talk about standard of care in just a minute. Just based on the fact that in this area, we're pretty lucky. 20 minutes from here up in New Hampshire, EMT Basics can put in some advanced airway adjuncts to better control the patient's airway. In Massachusetts, that is just absolutely unconscionable, unheard of, never going to happen. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's just because Massachusetts is behind the times? Because, I mean, really, we're on the cutting edge of all medical care that there happens to be available, right?
Maybe something happened to make them not want to do it.
That's a really good guess and a really good point. Realistically, the reason we have a bit more limited scope of practice sometimes here in Massachusetts is just based on the fact that we are so close to all the hospitals, all the big 5 hospitals down in Boston. I mean, our service area in this area particularly, we are never more than 10 minutes from a real for life trauma center where your patient could go from the emergency room doors to an operating room in 5 minutes. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in class is recognizing when a patient is sick and making good clinical decisions on treatment versus transport, and trying to decide what is going to get my patient to definitive care in a more timely fashion. So legally, in the state of Massachusetts, you are obligated to provide care only when you are being paid. So if you're out and about and not working in an ambulance and not on the clock here at Cataldo, and you see someone go into cardiac arrest, you can feel free to walk on by. That's going to be our duty to act that we'll talk about in just a minute. We already went over scope of practice. It's the care you're legally allowed to provide in the state that you work in. one of the things that we need to do is make sure that we know what we are supposed to do, what the state expects of us, what our protocols actually allow for us to provide for treatment. Because as important as knowing when to do something is knowing when not, or when you shouldn't do something based on what your scope of practice is. So your scope of practice is really a legal definition. That is the line in the sand, what you're allowed to do. Your standard of care is a bit different. It's a bit more of a fluid look at the same thing. The standard of care is a care that a similar EMT with your amount of training and experience would provide to manage a patient given the same situation. So it's really, it's measuring what you did as sort of reasonable versus not reasonable. And it's another one of those things that is sort of gray area, right? Is it reasonable to walk a patient to the ambulance on a broken leg? Anybody? Nobody?
Probably not a good idea.
Probably not a good idea, but
Oh, yeah, no.
what if the building you were in with them was on fire? So you see how scope of practice and standard of care, scope of practice would be to splint that broken leg, immobilize it before you move the patient, and then carry the patient out of the house to the ambulance. But reasonably speaking, if spontaneously the house burst into flames, walking that patient, dragging that patient, picking them up and running from the house screaming because, well, we're not firefighters, doesn't violate the standard of care. Do you see sort of where the two of those things live?
Yeah.
All right. So we have a bunch of duties. Look at them all 5 of them. We have a duty to act. We absolutely are obligated to provide service when we're on duty, period. So our duty to our patient means we're going to respect their rights. We're going to serve as their patient advocate, and we are going to do the things that we are legally obligated to do and morally obligated to do. But we also have a duty to ourselves. After maintaining our credentials and maintaining our skills, some of the things that we need to talk about is maintaining our bodies, maintaining our minds. Mental health has become sort of one of the silent problems here in public safety. That's something that you can't provide good care to your patient if you're not taking care of you. And the duty to our partner. That means we look out for one another for those same exact things. We want to make sure that we are taking care of each other because there's not a lot of us to go around. And if we're not keeping ourselves fit for duty, both mentally and physically, sooner rather than later, the system breaks. I mean, it got close with all this COVID stuff between people getting sick and people just getting out because they didn't want to be exposed, or just tax on the system and not overuse, but like a system that is being overused out of necessity. It becomes a bit of a challenge to stay mentally and physically in the game. So has anybody ever heard of this before? Good Samaritan laws?
Yep.
Yep.
All right. What's it mean?
You're not responsible for what would normally be considered a negligent act if you're acting in good faith.
Okay, I'll take it. So this is not something we can hang our hats on as professionals, right? This
No.
is intended for the lay public. It was enacted initially in California in 1959. It was for unpaid services. And remember, again, it does not prevent you from being sued. If, let's say, you're working on the ambulance, and we'll talk negligence and all of that stuff in just a couple minutes. But let's say you were working on an ambulance, you're being compensated for your time, so you are not going to be protected by a Good Samaritan law. If you are off duty and decide to help at aisle 2 in the market basket when somebody goes into cardiac arrest, and you provide care up to your level of ability, because nobody's going to be off duty walking around in aisle 2 of the market basket, you know, with a defibrillator and a bag valve mask and a portable radio to call for an ALS truck and all of the other things that we would have when we worked on the road. As long as you were acting in good faith, just like I believe it was Paul, right, said, and doing the things that you thought were helpful, you can still be sued, but the lawsuit won't be successful. People can, again, file a lawsuit for anything under the sun, but the Good Samaritan law will actually protect you from losing anything were you to be named in a suit, as long as you were acting in good faith and doing what you knew to be right. Sovereign immunity, that's another one of those things that probably isn't altogether too helpful for us right at the moment, because you guys are going to be working for a private service. Sovereign immunity is also known as governmental immunity. It prevents people who are treated by a government-operated EMS system, so like a municipal fire department with an EMS service, from suing the government for civil liability. Private services are not protected by sovereign immunity. It is just for municipal. Now, the statute of limitations on negligence and for malpractice and things of that nature is generally around 7 years, is about the extent of when you can be named in a suit for negligence. Does anybody remember what they were doing 7 years ago today?
Yeah, I was in the military.
What's that?
Yeah, I was in the military. I don't know exactly what I was doing, but
Well, that's the question, though. What were you doing exactly 7 years ago to this very day?
I had
I
another
was
place.
at a softball practice for sure.
I can barely remember what I had for breakfast. So trying to remember something from 7 years ago is just out of the question for me. That's just something that's not even plausible. Do you think you'd be able to remember specifics from any given call 7 years from after when you got your EMT certification and started working on a truck?
Probably not.
Yeah, things like patient condition and vital signs and things that you did that you were supposed to, things that you didn't do because you weren't supposed to, how you found the patient, where you found the patient. So what kind of things will protect us, do you think, from being named negligent? Or if we are named in a lawsuit, in a negligence lawsuit, what kind of things do you think we have to fall back on 7 years down the road?
Detailed reports.
Detailed reports. Absolutely. When we talk patient care reports, your patient care report is a legal document that will become part of your patient's permanent medical record. It pays to be very, very good and very detailed and very specific when you write reports, because that may be all you have to stand with in 6.5 years when a negligence lawsuit comes in front of you and you go, God, I don't even remember what ambulance company I was working for 6.5 years ago, let alone anything to do with this call. And you wind up, if you don't have a well-documented patient care encounter and don't have a good patient care report, you can wind up getting on the stand in front of a courtroom full of people and looking like a real jerk. Now, report writing isn't something that we do a whole ton of in EMT like training, because every company has their own specifics of what they want to see in a report. I'll tell you when we talk documentation and communication in a little bit. I write everything chronologically just because that's the way my brain works. If I don't start at the beginning and write straight through till the end, I'll never keep it straight. So chronologically means what I was sent for, where I was sent to, how I found the patient, how I moved the patient, what I did as far as treatment goes for the patient, and I go right on down the line to make sure all my I's are dotted and T's are crossed. Because, well, I know the statute of limitations for medical negligence far outweighs my ability to remember things. Then we have this last one, contributory negligence. This is something that will actually protect you in a situation where you could be named as defendant in a lawsuit. Contributory negligence means that through their own negligence, so through some act of the patient, they contributed to whatever happened to them. In just a few minutes, we'll talk things like refusals and who we can let refuse service versus who we can't. But sometimes we have to let a patient who is, mentally with it and able to answer all of our questions appropriately, pass all of our sort of mental status testing. Sometimes we have to let them sign a refusal knowing that they're probably having a heart attack or may go into cardiac arrest, or that within a short amount of time, we could get called back to that residence because that patient is much worse off than when we found them. Now, generally, when we start treatment of a sick patient, it would be negligent to leave them in their house, right?
What does that mean?
If we just began treatment of someone who we knew to be sick because we performed somebody called 911, we performed an assessment in their house, and they said, just vehemently and adamantly refused to go to the emergency room.
Oh, okay.
As long as they pass all the mental status questions and we can reasonably sort of, I want to say reasonably leave them there, because our end goal should be to transport everyone, right? We always transport people to the emergency room because they must have called 911 for a reason. But it's, in real talk here, at best, assault to try and drag somebody out of their house. And if they don't want to go to the emergency room and they are mentally competent, it's kidnapping if we drag them away. So, we're in a rock and a hard place, right? It's negligent to leave someone who we know to be sick, but it's not our negligence. That by itself is the real book definition of contributory negligence. Okay, we did everything we could do to try and make this person go to the emergency room. We provided all the care that we could, and the patient, knowing all the risks of not accepting transport and not accepting our care, contributed to the negligent situation, because we didn't want to leave him there, but we weren't going to wrestle grandpa to the ground and try and drag him out of his house that he's lived in for 75 years because he was vehemently refusing. He was conscious, alert, and oriented. He didn't smell of drugs or alcohol, didn't have a head injury, and the hits just keep on coming. So contributory negligence is when a patient's actions make the negligent situation happen. The damage was done by the patient themselves. Because we can go right back to our standard of care, right? Our standard of care would be to transport someone we know to be sick.
I have a quick question.
Shoot.
So when you are on the in the van and you have a partner, does one of you, and you both are there at the scene, which one of you is the one that writes the report, or do you write two reports?
It's one report, and it's whoever was responsible for patient care. So you work as a team, yes, but whoever is the EMT in the back of the ambulance when the patient gets transported is the one responsible for patient care. So that would be the person responsible for writing the report. And then both of your names actually wind up on the report. So there's a spot for, EMT1 and EMT2. So we got a little bit more terminology here. We have all sorts of ways we get our direction. We can pick up the phone and contact medical control if we're on scene with something that happens to be a little, confusing, or again, in one of those gray areas that we really tend to operate in, because it's impossible for every single situation to be covered in any text. Even medical school, that's why it's 12 years long, and there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pages that they wind up being responsible for. Medical direction is who we call when we either bump into something that we don't have an answer for, or there's specific times when maybe we want to give a patient a medication that we're allowed to dispense, but we have to get approval from medical control first. Medical control is just that. They control what we are and are not supposed to do on scene. We pick up the telephone, we tell them what the situation we have in front of us is, we give them a little bit of background information, we tell them what our assessment was, and then we make a recommendation, because we're the person eyes on this patient who can see exactly what it is that's going on. That is our communication with medical control, also known as online medical direction. Then we also have our standing orders, or our statewide treatment protocols. We have in Massachusetts a living document. The Massachusetts statewide treatment protocols is about 500 pages long, and it is written out exactly what it is we're supposed to do when presented with, a patient in cardiac arrest, or a patient in anaphylaxis, or a patient who's having low blood sugar. It is start to finish. It tells us how we're supposed to treat this patient, what we're supposed to do for them, what we're not supposed to do for them, things that we're supposed to look at. And really, at the end of the day, it is a pretty tidy document that covers most of our bases. Lucky for you guys, all the same information is in this textbook. So you're going to have a pretty lengthy protocol class here over the next 4.5 or so weeks, because our textbook generally falls pretty close to in line with the Massachusetts statewide treatment protocols, or our standing orders. The medications that we're going to cover when we go over pharmacology and we do our introduction to BLS emergency medicines. Any of the medicines that we talk about, for the most part, we're going to be able to give based on standing order. We don't actually very often have to pick up the telephone and ask a doctor, may I do this? We have the capabilities of assessing and figuring out these medical problems that require the medications that we're allowed to handle. And if we check enough boxes that say, yes, this patient is having a cardiac event, yes, this patient is in anaphylaxis, yes, my patient from asthma is having a difficult time breathing and would benefit from albuterol, we can just go right ahead and give those under our standing orders. All right, now we're going to talk morals and ethics. So ethics is the studies, wow, I talk good English. Ethics is the study of morals, of morality. Somebody tell me what morals actually are. What does it mean when you do something that's moral?
Something that's right.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's exactly what I was looking for. Morals are just the concepts of right and wrong. The National Association of EMTs has a code of ethics that is really just something that tells us to put patient welfare and patient care above all else, or we've acted unethically. We've done something immoral. It's not an easy thing to sort of teach somebody morals or ethics. It's really one of those things that you either are or you aren't. Everybody has a different sort of measuring stick for right versus wrong. And most of the wrong that we talk about in the field of medicine are people who do things that are just so apparently wrong that there is no room for debate. It's unethical. It's immoral. Um, let your conscience be your guide. Anybody ever seen the movie Pinocchio? Right? You get little Jiminy Cricket sitting on your shoulder. Um, do the things that seem right to you. Don't do the things that seem wrong to you. Is really the take-home point from this. If you are acting in your patient's best interest, then you are acting ethically and with good morals. If you are doing something that is not in your patient's best interest, then you are probably on the wrong side of the ethics and morality discussion. So in order to know how we can treat somebody and how a patient can refuse our treatment, we have to talk consent first. There is one long ton of ways that we obtain consent from our patients for treatment. There is really no question about it. We need to obtain consent before we put our hands on somebody. So first we have informed consent. Informed consent means we've talked to the patient, we've explained to them the risks associated with what it is that we want to do to care for them. We have explained to them the risks of what refusing care would entail. And the patient is now making an informed decision to say, yes, please, I would like you to do treatment X, Y, or Z and transport me to the emergency room. What the treatment is really not altogether that important. What most of our whole role in the medical game here is talking to our patients and making sure that, we, as the first face that they see in an emergent type situation, treat them like a person. Everybody, one of my biggest complaints about going to the doctor sometimes is being treated like just a chart number or a disease rather than being treated like an actual human being. And the way we can kind of combat that a little bit is by using a bit of, informed consent. Talk to your patient, tell them what you're going to do, ask their permission. It's something just as simple as, can I check your blood pressure? Once they say yes, you've gotten your informed consent for treatment. But what do we do in a situation where a patient maybe isn't talking to us? Or like this guy right here on the ground in the picture, does not appear as if he's doing a lot of informing or expressing at the moment, does it?
No.
No, he looks pretty unresponsive, I would say. So if he's laying on the ground unresponsive, what gives us the right as providers to take care of them?
Implied consent.
Implied consent, indeed. Implied consent means that a reasonable person who, were they competent and capable of making the decision to ask you and express their consent, would. So informed and expressed consent are kind of hand in hand. We inform the patient of risk versus reward, and the patient says, yes, please go ahead and do that. We've informed them, they've expressed. Our implied consent patient, we can't actually have that discussion with them. So in order to be able to treat them, we operate under the facts that if this patient was conscious and alert and making, normal people decisions, they would want us to care for them. And then we move down to one that's a bit more tricky. Consent to treat a minor. Now, consent to treat a minor must be obtained from a parent, legal guardian, or someone else who has been granted the right to make those kinds of decisions. So when kids are in school, the school administration can actually say, please transport little Timmy to the emergency room. But what if, we're at the local skate park and little Timmy has crashed and burned on his skateboard pretty bad, and he needs to be transported to the emergency room, and there's not a parent to be found anywhere because, well, little Timmy's 14 years old and goes to the skate park by himself. How is it possible to obtain consent to treat that minor patient?
Would that be if he's voluntary? I don't know, but are we involuntary consent?
No, involuntary is a little different. It would be one of the things on this page.
You would still treat him, but it would be an implied consent because you would assume that the parent would want their child treated.
Bingo. So again, we go back to reasonable, right? A lot of what we do is measured versus reasonable versus unreasonable. So we would think that if mom or dad or a caregiver or a guardian or whoever was there, that they would express their consent for us to treat little Timmy who just wrecked on his skateboard. And since they're not there, we would imply that they would want us to treat little Timmy who just crashed and burned on his skateboard. So we make efforts after we've provided our care to, get a hold of mom and dad or have the hospital get a hold of mom and dad. But we can treat based on implied consent because a reasonable parent or legal guardian or whoever would want us to put little Timmy back together and bring him to the emergency room.
Right, but what if the kid was nervous or something that he got hurt and didn't want to go and said he was fine? Could we, as EMTs, could you believe that and not treat him?
No,
Because
children under the age of 18, except for in a couple of very specific circumstances, actually cannot refuse treatment. So, what are they? They are kids under the age of 18 who have already joined the military, kids under the age of 18 who happen to be pregnant, or under the age of 18 who have legally been emancipated as a minor. Now, for the most part, nobody knows these things but us. There's no real way to prove one versus the other, so it's a difficult thing to really accept a refusal from someone under the age of 18 and sort of have a positive outcome from it, because without fail, refusals will get reviewed by quality assurance and quality improvement, and somebody's going to want to know why you accepted a refusal from someone who was under the age of 18, and rightfully so.
But what if the child was like not cooperating and just trying to run away from you and like all that?
Well, if they run away, elopement is a police issue. Elopement's not an EMS issue.
Right.
So if little Timmy grabs a skateboard and runs away, that becomes a law enforcement issue, and thankfully it takes us sort of right out of the fold.
Okay.
And much like just anybody else who's reasonable, when little Timmy has the option to go home in a police car or go to the emergency room in an ambulance, probably going to get in the ambulance.
Right.
And then last but not least, we have involuntary consent. In Massachusetts, involuntary consent is what we call the Section 12. Section 12 is a legal document filled out by only a very select group of people. I'll print these out and we can go over them when you guys come in a little bit later on. But it is legally binding for us to transport somebody against their will. It is really only applied to people that are mentally incompetent and deemed to be a danger to either themselves or others. That's really about the only times that it is advisable to transport somebody against their will, is when they have the Section 12 paperwork filled out, and that pretty much says that it's your legal obligation to transport them wherever that document tells you to bring them. So advanced directives, that is in Massachusetts nowadays what we call a MOLST form. You see that bottom bullet point where it says physician order for life-sustaining treatment, or POLST. In Massachusetts, we had to be different again, and we changed that for either medical orders for life-sustaining treatment or Massachusetts, depending on who you talk to, because they put on the form, I'm going to go back a slide here in just a second, but they put on the form both Massachusetts and medical. So it should be MOLST, really, but you know. DNRs are kind of going the way of the dodo. This do not resuscitate order was something that prior to the POLST or MOLST orders was a form that came with a little paper bracelet that the patient was supposed to wear. You needed to have the actual physical document there in front of you so you could match the number on the bracelet to the piece of paper. And it was a cumbersome process, and nobody ever had the paperwork with them like they were supposed to, and it just became a little bit of a nightmare. And what this was a form that directed our resuscitation efforts. If the patient were to go into cardiac arrest, if they had a do not resuscitate order, that's what that meant. It meant do not resuscitate. We would see that piece of paper, we would match it to the bracelet, and we would not perform cardiac arrest management like we're going to learn about a little bit later on. It was a catch-all. It really only dealt with issues of resuscitation. So there's some other things that we do that maybe isn't cardiac arrest management that are wildly unpleasant. And if a patient is pretty familiar with the fact that their expiration date and life expectancy is coming to an end, maybe they wouldn't want us to do. That's why we have upgraded. Now, since most of the DNR people have since passed on because it's an old style of doing things, we use these MOLST forms. And unlike the DNR that just said, yep, don't do CPR on people that have these that go into cardiac arrest, the MOLST form or the POST form allows the patient to make choices. It's not just don't do this if I'm in cardiac arrest, don't do CPR. The MOLST form really gives them options. So if we look at some of this stuff, any boxes checked on the left. Now this is just kind of quick down and dirty when you actually are on scene and have one of these forms handed to you. First of all, they have to be completely filled out. They have to be signed. But if you look at all the options on the left-hand side, do not resuscitate, do not intubate and ventilate, do not use non-invasive, do not transfer to the hospital. So if you see on this form bubbles on the left-hand side of it filled in, that means your patient really doesn't want to be worked. They don't want us to do all of the things necessary to try and make them survive should, negative outcomes happen to them and they go into cardiac arrest or they go into respiratory arrest or they have some other pretty significant medical issue that on our average everyday, for our average everyday patient, we would work like dogs to try and make that better. These patients don't want that, and that is their right. It is absolutely something that we should honor as long as we make sure all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed on this form. If you look at the right-hand side of these check boxes on the form here, it says attempt resuscitation, intubate and ventilate, use non-invasive ventilation, transfer to the hospital. If you start seeing bubbles checked on the right-hand side of this form, that means do what is necessary. So this gives your patient the option to decide, all right, I don't mind, being intubated and placed on a ventilator until I get to the hospital. And then they can decide whether this is going to be care that even makes any difference for me, and at which point they could shut life support off and I could pass on peacefully. But I don't want people doing CPR on me. I don't want to be transferred to the hospital, but you can, It's just, it gives patients a little bit of autonomy, because really when we're talking about, life and death and patients who are prepared to pass away, because that's who has these forms, um, they should have some autonomy. They should be able to make some decisions ahead of time so that a resuscitation that maybe they didn't want doesn't happen. Has anybody ever done CPR?
Yes.
It's violent, isn't it?
If you're not hearing ribs crack, you're not pushing hard enough.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I mean, we worked one during a clinical shift that I worked a while back, long while back now. And I mean, this guy walked into the emergency room talking normal human, normal mental status, and within 5 minutes was in cardiac arrest. And we worked that cardiac arrest for an hour and a half. And by the time we were finished, like, he was mush from the belly button up, because they didn't know why he had died, and they decided we were going to work until they could figure something out. It didn't have a positive outcome, and if he had had one of these forms, we wouldn't have worked at all.
I have a
So
question.
yeah,
Why sometimes it would have DNR, like do not resuscitate or do not intubate, but transfer to the hospital? What's
so
the
there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily going to cause this patient to die. You could have something as simple as an infection that needs some IV antibiotics and get transferred to the hospital, get some IV antibiotics, and be better in a couple days, get discharged from the hospital, and go on to live another 5 or 10 years. So that's why they would have transfer to the hospital. Do not resuscitate generally is kind of specific to, like, if I actually go into cardiac arrest, so cardiopulmonary failure, like my heart stops beating, I stop breathing, I don't want you, jumping up and down on my chest at a rate of 100 to 120 times a minute, because what quality of life is downstream from that? Whereas if it was just something simple and we transfer them to the hospital and they get better and they go on to live, another couple weeks, another couple months, another couple years, that's a different story. That makes sense?
Yeah.
All right. So in order to accept a refusal from a patient, we have to make sure that they are competent. They must be lucid and capable of making an informed decision. So that means not only can they understand what we're telling them when we are getting their consent, they can express to us that they understand and are able to fully get what it is that could happen to them should they refuse treatment. Any patient can refuse care at any time. And even if it results in their death, they still, right up until the point where they go unresponsive, can refuse that care. Because what happens as soon as they go unresponsive?
It becomes implied consent.
It becomes implied consent. And now no longer are we arguing with a patient who doesn't want to go to the emergency room because they don't think they're sick or they don't think they need to, or just because they don't want to. Now they're unresponsive and they're in cardiac arrest. And our standard of care for patients in cardiac arrest without a DNR or a MOST form is to provide CPR. So we would provide CPR, we would use implied consent to bring them to the emergency room, and we provide care and treatment the entire way. I actually have friends that had happened to. They waited in somebody's, they had them all hooked up on the cardiac monitor, and the patient's heart was doing all sorts of wonky, sort of sideways things. And patient adamantly, vehemently refusing, you are not transporting me anywhere. I don't want to go to the emergency room. We're not doing this today. And they waited. And within 5 or 10 minutes of waiting, the patient actually coded and went into cardiac arrest, and they worked the cardiac arrest and transported him to the emergency room. So look at what makes somebody lucid. Look at what makes somebody competent here on this form. And this is a very in-depth refusal checklist, because we need to actually cover our bases and make sure that we're not leaving someone in their living room who is incapable of making the decision to refuse treatment. So oriented to person, place, time, and situation, that is really our mental status questions that we're going to be checking off on every single patient. We'll be doing patient assessment pretty soon. We'll have the lecture, and we'll talk about all aspects of patient assessment here very shortly, but we need to make sure they're oriented to person, place, time, and situation or event. So who they are, where they are, within reason, what time of day or time of year it is, and situation is something simple. Why'd you call 911 today? How did we come to meet today? Altered level of consciousness, that's how we tell if the lights are on. So when we're checking a patient's level of consciousness, we use a particular assessment tool called AVPU. AVPU stands for alert, verbal, painful, or unresponsive. If my patient's just looking at me as I'm walking into the room and reacting appropriately, I know they're alert. If I have to yell, "Hey, Bill," in order to get my patient's attention and get them to look at me, well, I know now they're only alert to verbal stimulus. If my patient doesn't even do that when I yell their name and I have to give them a little pinch or a little some other painful stimuli, well, then I know they're only alert to painful stimulus. And if none of those things work, my patient is unresponsive. And really, if we can't make it past options 1 and 2 on our patient refusal checklist, we're finished here. Because if my patient's unresponsive, I can't answer any of the rest of this stuff. I have no business even thinking about taking a refusal from them, because we know the lights are off, and if they're not oriented to person, place, time, and situation, also nobody's home. So a no answer to really any of these, as far as person, place, time, situation, or they asked that one weird, level of consciousness. So a no answer to person, place, time, and situation means they are not oriented to those things and they are not competent to make this decision. And then getting down to 2, 3, and 4, a yes answer to any of those also means they are not competent and cannot make the decision to refuse care. And attached to our paperwork here at Cataldo, you will see these exact questions and these exact things written out, because not only do you want to protect yourself in a situation where a patient is trying to refuse treatment, Cataldo wants to protect itself as well and make sure that we're not taking refusals that we shouldn't be and sort of hanging them out in the breeze. So how do we cover our butts when it comes time to take a patient refusal? I know we already talked patient care report. That's going to cover you in almost any and every situation. But what else can we do?
Have a witness.
I like the idea of having a witness. Patient's family is often great to get as a witness to the refusal, because they're going to want their family member to go be evaluated and treated. And if you can get the patient's family to say, yes, this person did do everything humanly possible to try and get grandpa to go to the emergency room, but grandpa's kind of a grouchy old cuss and didn't want to go, and this is why we're here today. Be prepared to be on scene for a long time with a refusal. I will, to the point of being super annoying, do just about anything to get a patient to go to the emergency room versus sign a refusal, because it is, and this is purely selfish, I will admit to that right now, it is so much more work to document a refusal than it is for me to just pick somebody up here in Malden and drive them the 1.5 miles to the CHA in Everett, drop them off, and be on about my business for the rest of the day. There's like no work at all involved in that. It's easy. But going through that checklist and making sure that I do all of these things here, like trying to persuade your patient, beg, borrow, steal, barter, whatever it takes to try and get them to go to the emergency room, or getting on the phone with medical control and trying to get the doctor to be able to talk the patient into going to the emergency room. Like, how long do you think all of this takes? Does it sound like the recipe to be on scene, stuck with a patient who doesn't even really want you there forever? Anybody?
Doesn't sound like a good time.
Yeah, it's not a rockin' good time. It really isn't. It's so much easier to just, when the patient is sort of a cooperating, a willing participant, get in the habit of making sure that your patient understands what could happen to them if they were to refuse care and transport. And I hang my hat on the fact that even if they called me for a stubbed toe or a hangnail, I just want to be sure that you're aware that refusing care and transport to the emergency room could result in further complications down the road, up to and including your death. Now, is that a little over the top maybe for a stubbed toe or a hangnail? Sure. But then I back it up. You could all of a sudden, you may have a bleeding disorder and you could all of a sudden spring a leak that we aren't going to get here in time to manage. Or, you could wind up with an infection from that stubbed toe and the break in the skin's integrity, and you could go septic and die before anybody even realized that you could go to bed tonight and not wake up tomorrow morning. Does it sound a little over the top?
Yeah, but as long as they don't know that.
Yeah, it sounds over the top, but it's also plausible. And if I'm standing there in your living room telling you, hey, you could die from this, not only does it bring the patient back into focus a little bit, but it also now gets the family even more on your side. Because at the end of the day, all I really want is to take you from where you are that you called 911 and bring you to the emergency room and drop you off. If there's really nothing wrong with you, the emergency room is going to take one look at you, patch you all back up, and send you on your merry way. Everybody has a good day. Congratulations, another life saved. But if not, then, really it's out of my control, and God only knows what happens once we leave. But we have to make sure we do everything humanly possible to try and convince this patient to go to the emergency room, period. There's no room to sort of seek refusals and try and talk people into not going to the emergency room. Because believe it or not, that's a thing, because people are lazy. But when all else fails and you couldn't get that patient to go to the emergency room, document everything, everyone that was there, everything that you said, everything that you tried, anything and everything that you did to try and get this patient to go to the emergency room needs to be documented in your patient care report. Because remember, the statute of limitations for negligence is 7 years. And sitting on the stand and saying, because that's how I always do it, after they say, well, how do you know you did all those things? It's not documented. And you go, oh, crap. Tommy told me in my first day of EMT class that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Because if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So document everything and go through your documentation with a fine-toothed comb, especially in a situation where your patient is going to try and refuse care.
Has there ever been a situation where you really thought, for lack of a better word, the patient was ridiculous for even calling 911, just in your own opinion, and like really didn't think that they needed to go, but you did anyways because that's, like you said, you selfishly want to make sure you cover your own back and everything?
Oh, sure. And I mean, I guess really at the end, and this is the way that I kind of look at situations like that, because, and I'm not talking about the people who call 911 9,512 times in a month. if somebody picked up the phone and called 911, regardless of what my thoughts on their problem really are, it was significant enough for them to have an ambulance, a fire engine, and a police car come screaming across the city at 2 o'clock in the morning and wake all their neighbors up and light their neighborhood up like a carnival. So something must be going on. So, really, at the end of the day, whether I think it's significant or whether I don't really think they are very, very ill is immaterial because they did.
Right.
All right, we have reached a good point to take a short break. So I'm going to pop a timer up here on the screen. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll do the last little bits of our medical legal.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. right, everybody, we are back. So we're going to talk some other legal aspects of being an EMT. Now, thankfully, this top one here, criminal liability, is generally not something that we run afoul of. Criminal liability means you actually did something criminally wrong that could result in a fine or even going to jail while you were working as an EMT. So this is, you've been arrested. The government has actually brought charges against you, and you are on your way to jail based on something you did while you were performing your duties as an EMT. That is obviously negative good. It's not good for you. It's not good for the profession. It is not good for just public relations in general, on top of the fact that, you're on your way to jail. Then we have civil action. So civil action, the person who is the plaintiff brings a lawsuit against probably everyone. Don't feel bad. You won't be on that lawsuit alone. Generally speaking, when medical malpractice or negligence suits are filed, or torts, which is really what it's called, when they're filed, everyone gets named. You'll get named, your partner will get named, the ER will get named, the doc will get named, Cataldo ambulance will get named. They name everybody on the lawsuit in hopes of whoever has the deepest pockets making a settlement. And really what they are trying to prove is that you were negligent in your duty. Either you did something that you shouldn't have, you didn't do something that you should have, and the patient had some sort of outcome from it. Because first and foremost, they have to prove that you had a duty to act as an EMT. So when do we have a duty to act again?
Whenever we're on the clock.
Absolutely. Once you've punched in, you have a duty to act. The next thing that they have to prove is that you breached that duty. So, things like getting a 911 call that's going to get you out late, but you're still on the clock, so you are being compensated for your time. You had a duty to respond to that call, and you said, you know what? No, I'm going home. And you packed up your things and went on your merry way. Well, you have been assigned a job. You have been dispatched to a person in need of ambulance response. So you have breached that duty at that point. The third thing that needs to be proven is that the patient suffered some sort of injury or harm. It needs to be something that has been recognized as compensable. So it needs to be something that's proven that your breach of duty caused them injury. And then the last one is the injuries were a direct result of that breach. If all four of these things cannot be proven, then negligence cannot be found against you. Now, that doesn't mean, hooray, we have a parade, everything's great, because being named in a negligence lawsuit is also clearly something nobody, puts their uniform on, gets dressed in the morning and hopes, boy, I hope I wind up in court over something I do today. But these are the four things. You had a duty to act, you breached that duty, the patient suffered some form of harm, and that harm was a direct result of your breach of duty. So we covered this pretty good. Duty to act is your obligation to respond to a scene, provide emergency care for a patient. That's it, period. That is your duty to act. You have an obligation to that. Now, do you think you still have a duty to act in dangerous environments?
Yes.
You think so?
Only once the scene has been made safe, yes.
Yeah, once the scene has been made safe. That's an important thing to think about, because for the next month, we will preach scene safety, scene safety, scene safety. because you don't have a duty to run into dangerous situations or burning buildings or anything of that nature, because your duty is to provide emergency care as a healthcare provider. We are not law enforcement. We are not the fire department. So until a reasonable amount of safety has been assured, it is okay to not act. That is not a breach of your duty to act. Because what happens if you turn yourself into another patient?
Can't help anybody.
Not only can you not help anybody, but then other people, other responders, police, fire, other EMS providers are going to take chances to get you out of the situation that you put yourself into. So did you make yourself a positive or a negative on that situation?
Negative.
Yeah, you made yourself a negative. Now we're requiring care and rescue and more treatment, and still we have patients. So you do not breach a duty to act when the scene is unsafe or there is some form of obstacle in your way from being able to provide care directly. Once you have established your relationship with the patient as a caregiver, you're locked in. There's pretty much no ability to get out of that situation unless a safety concern arrives.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Um, so when an ambulance goes to the scene, obviously the fire department and the police department go right every time, or is it
Most of the time. Most of
they go
the
every
most of the municipalities around, we do a multi-level response. Most of the time when one goes out, all three go out. An
right?
ambulance, a cruiser, and a fire engine will go. That's not an always thing, but especially now with COVID, a lot of the fire departments aren't responding to like simple medicals.
Does
But
anybody take rank over an EMT at that point because of their training? Or like, is it just our obligation as EMTs to go and treat the patient? Or is it, what if like or a police officer has more rank and just kind of not pushes you out of the way, but there's situations where they're like, no, I know how to handle this. And I'm sure there's been situations like that. I just was wondering if, what do you do in the
yeah,
situation?
that's a tight spot to be in because, places like Cataldo is the largest 911 provider in the state of Massachusetts. We got that way and we stay that way by having good relationships, good working relationships with the police and fire that we're on the same team with. But at a medical call, the medical patient gets. I'm the person who says what somebody needs as far as medical care goes.
Mhm.
Um, unless they need to be brought to jail or be put out with a 2.5-inch fire hose, until they are on fire or need to be arrested, if it's a medical call and a medical patient, I'm the say.
Okay.
And that's not always popular, but that's right because that is your duty.
Okay. Thank you.
For the most part, police do not want to step into that role because now they're on the line.
Ain't that the truth? Yeah, you definitely in our industry, as a medical provider, uh, ABC stands for airway, breathing, and circulation. If you have any friends or family that happen to be in the law enforcement profession, ABC means to them ambulance before cruiser.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll be all too happy most of the time, and the fire department really as well to hand over patient care duties once we show up.
And I hate to say it this way, but even if the police did take them, when they get to the jail won't accept them. So now the cops are the ones that have to sit in the ER with this kid until he gets cleared.
Yep. So yeah, most of the time it doesn't really wind up in a huge disagreement with the police departments and the fire departments because they are happy to hand over to us because this is our piece of it. That's what we do. So we've talked negligence pretty much over and over and over again, because that is sort of where medicine winds up in the most trouble. And negligence comes in a couple of different flavors. Negligence, really, at the root of it is deviation from the standard of care. So we go right back to that. Did what I did for this patient make sense? Would somebody else with my level of training, my level of experience, have made the same decisions? So anything that deviates from the standard of care can technically be negligence. Negligence can be simple or gross. Simple negligence means we made a mistake. We should have known that we should have done something and either didn't or forgot to, or, gave the wrong medicine, and, a mistake was made, and then they prove all four pieces of that negligence. So I had a duty to act. I breached that duty because I made a mistake. The patient was harmed, and my breach of duty was the cause of that harm. Okay, I made a mistake. We're people, not machines, and mistakes do happen. The best thing you can do, should you make a mistake, is own it. Admit to it. Say, yes, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I won't do it again. The state of Massachusetts and the National Registry of EMTs don't just come with, a shredder and shred your EMT certification right there in front of you and send you on your merry way to never work in an ambulance again, for the most part. Especially if you are upfront and honest and just say, you know what, I realize now that I made a mistake and I'm sorry. You wind up having to do some remediation or write what I like to sort of jokingly refer to as an I'm sorry letter. And then once you've done all that, you just don't do it again. But the other side of that is gross negligence. Gross negligence is not a mistake. Gross negligence is something you willfully did that you knew pretty much was incorrect. So you've done something reckless. And in doing something reckless, you've committed gross negligence. Did something that knowingly was not going to be helpful for this patient. And now you have again had a duty to act. You've breached that duty. There was harm, and your actions or inactions were a result of that harm. And there's all sorts of examples of this. There was not too long ago, it was, I believe, in either New York or New Jersey, there was a car accident, and there was a pregnant female driving the vehicle, and she was dead, like for real dead. There was not gonna be a save. And they called medical control, and medical control answered the phone and gave them some medical direction. The medical direction that medical control gave was to perform an emergency cesarean section on scene and transport the baby. Now, I could hand you every EMS textbook ever made, and you would not find in any of those textbooks direction or advice on performing an emergency C-section, because that is so far and away outside of our scope of practice that never should that be done. The crew did it because medical control told them to. So do you think they were safe from being found negligent?
Yeah.
They weren't. They were both fired and lost their right to practice. And it was gross negligent.
They were told to do it though.
They were
But they
told
knew
to
it
do
was wrong.
it. But yes, exactly. The direction was wrong. Just because medical control gives you a direction, they don't always know what is our scope of practice. They don't always know sort of what our general wheelhouse is all the time. And if a doctor ever gives you an order like that, the very next thing you should say is, you're going to come down here and do that, right? Because there are certain things where it is just not only inappropriate and inadvisable, but outright crazy to think that we're going to do on a street corner. An emergency C-section being one of them.
No, absolutely. But what if I don't know, like, so what do? Do you transport them or do you wait for the doctor? What was your?
They never should have accepted the order. When medical control, I don't know what malfunctioned in those two people's brains that day that made them think that it was a good idea. But if medical control tells you something that is just bonkers, ask them to repeat it, because it's been my experience that every once in a while somebody will say something wacky, and then you make them repeat it, and they go, "Oh no, wait a minute, that's not right." And like the second time they hear it come out of their mouth, they're like, "What did I just tell them to do? Am I nuts?" Because yeah,
So obviously the baby didn't survive.
yeah, nobody lived. It was a bad day.
But what if, I'm not saying, I mean, I do a lot of this, but what if the baby did survive? Would they?
Um, it probably would have gone. It probably would have gone bad anyway, because clearly they made no real attempts at preserving mom. So even if a patient out of the two had a positive outcome, one of them was still going to have a negative.
But they knew the, I don't know if you cut out or anything. I wasn't sure, but I kind of got the last piece of that. But the mom was already dead. And so what if they did save, so they knew that going in. So what if they did save the baby? Would they still have gotten fired? Or would they be quote unquote heroes in that situation, even though they weren't supposed to do what they did?
No, I mean, you probably, especially because it is just so far outside of the realm of things that are considered okay,
Right.
they probably still wind up in a jam one way or the other. And it's written and things are done that way really for the protection of good providers.
Hmm.
Because I can tell you, as much as that situation is awful, all around terrible, I can tell you that I would not have carried out that order, because there's no way for any of that to end in a positive fashion. And I know this. I drink too much coffee to cut in a straight line. We already were in trouble. Um, there's just it saves, good providers from people that want to run around and be cowboys and just do whatever they want,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
that's how we wind up in trouble. Covered all of this. All right, here we go. Now we're getting to one really other aspect where EMTs can get themselves in trouble. When we assume patient care, we are responsible for that patient care until it is taken over by someone of an equal or higher training. So until patient care is taken over by someone of equal and higher training, we are duty bound. It is our duty to act and care for that patient. Stopping any care before someone else takes over for us is what's called abandonment. So when we get to the emergency room, we have to have a face-to-face patient care handoff with the people that are going to be responsible for that patient's care, the nurse, the doctor. We can't just dump a patient in an emergency room bed and leave, because if we do, we have abandoned that patient. That's how patients get lost in the emergency room and wind up laying in bed for hours and hours and hours without anybody ever coming to see them, because no actual proper handoff had taken place and the hospital didn't even realize they were there. It has to be done person to person, and it has to be done with someone who has at least the same level of training as you do. So as EMTs, you are going to have to talk to another EMT, a paramedic, a nurse, a doctor, someone who has at least the same amount of training as you. We can't pass off patient care to the receptionist at a doctor's office or the intake person in triage at an emergency room. Someone with actual medical training has to be taking over care for this patient and assuming that responsibility, or we have technically abandoned them. Does everybody know the difference between assault and battery?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. I heard some yeses, I heard some no. So assault is telling somebody, I'm going to beat the crap out of you. Battery is then actually doing it. So this is not, again, one of those things that is really big in the world of EMS, because why even get involved in something like this? If we are trying to transport people against their will, we are guilty of both assault and battery. Assault because I'm taking you whether you like it or not. Well, there's my simple assault. Battery comes the minute I put my hands on them. And then actually the physical act of dragging them away and bringing them somewhere against their will, now I'm also guilty of kidnapping. So the only time we sort of wind up in a pinch with things like this, because I don't think people get jobs as EMTs because they want to ride around and slap people around. That's not really what we're about. The only time we really wind up in these types of weird legal situations is when it comes to patient refusal and transporting patients against their will. It's a lot easier to kind of badger somebody into going to the emergency room with you than it is to try and drag them away. And that's not something that family members all the time understand. If you're working and responding to like nursing homes and things like that, they'll call all the time, and it's just like, I don't care, she doesn't want to go. You have to just take her. And it's no, that's not the way this works. Like, if you want somebody to drag this person away, you should have called and asked for a police car. Nick, I see you raised your hand. Did you have a question?
No. Sorry, I hit that by accident.
That's all right. I get click happy sometimes too, so no worries. We covered that. We're almost there. We've almost trudged our way through medical legal. Just to make sure that we're hitting all the points. How's everybody doing with the lecture so far? Good pace? All of
Yeah,
that
not
fun
bad.
stuff?
Yeah, good.
Good pace.
Just want to make sure I'm not losing anybody or driving anybody like stark raving mad just yet.
Give me a minute.
All right, so defamation, slander, and libel. Defamation is releasing information, either written or spoken, that can damage a patient's character. So defamation is written or spoken things. The spoken form of defamation is typically referred to as slander. So they're kind of the same, only defamation most of the time is written words against somebody's character or reputation. Slander is spoken. So you can say things slanderous about a patient very, very easily. You know, you will come to see that when we respond to 911 calls, some addresses will pop up over and over and over and over and over again. Some patients will pop up over and over and over and over and over again. You need to be careful what you say. You need to be careful what you put on your Facebook, because these are real things that people do get in trouble for: defamation and slander. And then libel is if either one of those things are false. So you can be guilty of defamation and slander and have them be true. If they're false, you are also guilty of libel. Libel means you have made a false statement about someone's character or reputation in a damaging fashion. And the last little bit we're going to talk about here is everybody's favorite, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This is something that protects patient privacy. The real 10,000-foot view of HIPAA is anything that you get in the course of an EMS call. So anything that is relayed or conveyed to you is protected healthcare information, period. And it shouldn't be shared with anyone unless they are going to be responsible for patient care in some form or another. So anything that you find out in your commission of duties as an EMT is protected healthcare information. That means we don't tell other people back at the station what we found out about a patient. We don't, talk to the news if we're at some sort of high profile incident. Basically, the word of the day is say nothing. The only people you can share protected healthcare information with are other people responsible for the patient care. So if you and your partner are discussing care for a patient, or when you go to do that handoff of a patient to someone of equal or higher training so that you weren't guilty of abandonment, you can tell the nurse or doctor or whoever else is going to be assuming your patient care duties anything and everything that is pertinent to the patient's condition. It looks like Corey can't. Is anybody else having an audio problem?
No, I seem to be good.
Yeah, me too.
No.
So far, so good.
Corey, hang on. I'm looking to see if anything's weird on my end. Give me just a second. So we don't really have any jurisdiction-specific laws when it comes to this. The HIPAA Act is a federal government run program. They are the ones that came up with all this and provided us with this legislation and directive. Every year, actually, and when you guys go and get your EMT certification and start the orientation process,
Did it cut off for everyone?
no, I stopped talking for a second.
Oh, okay.
I just muted and unmuted myself. See how it's going now. All right, back to this. So HIPAA was brought around in 1996. It is a federal law that protects patient healthcare information and really controls very, very tightly when and how health information is given out. Even patients need to fill out a release to access their own information. We need written documentation from the patient to provide them with their medical records. So we have no business just kind of talking to whoever about any patient protected healthcare information. And that is definitely something to keep in mind. If you're at something that's high profile or transport someone with some notoriety, the news has the damnedest way of being able to figure all that kind of stuff out. And it is entirely possible that you could wind up with a microphone in front of you. I can assure you that Cataldo Ambulance has somebody whose job it is to speak to the news media. And it's not mine, and it probably won't be any of yours. So just don't say anything. The other thing to keep in mind is like your logins for the patient care reporting software and for the computers. We need to make sure that we are not just leaving things open for anyone and everyone to see, because that can be a violation of your patient's HIPAA protections. Paul, I see you got a hand up too. Did you have a question?
Okay, no, I was just, you had us muted. I didn't know if it was something you knew about.
Yeah, something weird has been going on. I know Corey was having a problem and everybody else seemed to be okay. And now her problem's fixed and it looks like I messed up everybody else's. Can everybody hear me now?
I can hear you.
We
Yeah.
could hear you. It was just you had us muted.
Oh, all right. Well, I think I got it all set now.
Okay.
You guys can hear me, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
All right. That is our medical, legal, and ethical lecture for chapter number 3. What'd you guys think of your first lecture?
That's good.
Not bad.
Yeah.
All right. All right. I am going to give you guys another short break to kind of digest some of that and think of any questions that you could come up with. And when we come back, we will talk communications.
All right, thank you.
Yep. All right, I'm back. Sorry, I was a minute or two late coming back from break. I was paperwork. Paperwork is the bane of my existence. You guys will come to think the same thing when it comes to report writing and making sure you have all your paperwork lined up and ducks in a row.
Yeah.
Every time you think it's finished, somebody adds to the mountain. All right, let's talk communications here for a little bit. It starts out talking about radios and how they work and what they do. And what I can tell you is radios are not my thing. I worked in communications for quite a while. And when I pushed the button on the radio, if the radio didn't work, I immediately muttered a curse word, dropped the radio, and picked up the telephone because I don't know how to fix them. I don't know what's wrong with them if they're not working. What I know is when I push to talk button, if the radio works, great. If the radio does not work, I need to come up with something else. I worked with a guy in dispatch who I don't know how he maintained his sanity because all day long we'd be on the radio at work. And then his hobby outside of work was he was a ham radio operator. So he legitimately like slept and breathed radios for all the time of his waking existence. And I don't know how he did it. Malachi, this room should look familiar to you.
It does.
Yeah. You can hear the phone ringing when you look at this picture, can't you?
Or the nurses yelling at me.
Yeah, well, that's pretty common too. God bless you. So, radio communications has some different components. The first thing we'll talk about is the radio base station. The radio base station is the more high-powered of our communication devices. Base stations generally have about 80 to 150 watts, and they have an antenna that is generally building mounted within a short distance of the base station. That is what is actually responsible for sending out the transmission and receiving the transmissions from the field effectively. The powers that these radio antennas and base stations are allowed to have is controlled by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. They also have the ability to listen to and communicate on our radio channels. There are certain things that are allowed when using, open air radio communications, and there are certain things that are not. They can levy some pretty significant fines for using radio communications inappropriately or using inappropriate language. So a base station is located in Malachi's favorite office in all of Cataldo land, in the dispatch communication center. The antenna is right outside the garage because in order for that high-powered signal to get out, the radio has to send the message and the antenna has to transmit the message. On top of that, the same thing has to happen in reverse when we talk from our vehicles or our portable radios. Annie, that's no problem. I actually remembered to click the record button, so we're good there. I'll send the recordings out to you guys when they download. Oh no, I just changed the language to German. That's not even a joke. Oh boy. All right. We'll deal with that later.
I don't see any German.
No, it's on my screen.
Well,
It flashes at me when somebody says something in the chat room, and I was trying to make that go away, and I changed my screen to German. That's awesome. Oh, funny. So, after our radio base stations and their 80 to 150 watts of power, we have mobile radios. Mobile radios are named because they are, well, mobile. These are the truck-mounted radios. They have about 20 to 50 watts of transmission power. Low power means less range. So the base station transmits the furthest. Our mobile radios generally can transmit on average terrain between 10 to 15 miles. So that means as long as you are within a 10 to 15 mile radius of a repeater, which was one of the other things they showed in that picture, that dish on the top of other radio antenna equipment that actually just picks up the signal, magnifies it, and bounces it on down the line until it gets back to where we were sending it. So to use your portable radio, you don't have to be 10 to 15 miles within that 10 to 15 mile radius of your base station. You just have to be within 10 to 15 miles of equipment that your radio will operate on. Transmission can be affected by terrain. That's an absolute fact. If you are way down in, a valley, or there's some places in Boston where there's giant buildings on either side kind of blocking out the sun, your vehicle mounted radio, your mobile radio may not work. In situations like that, thank God for cell phones, because we have the ability to just pick up the phone and reach out and touch someone and get a hold of just about anybody we need to. And then last but not least, moving our way down the power rankings, we have our portable radios. Again, called a portable radio because it is person portable. You can attach this to your belt and bring it with you everywhere you go. The portable radios have generally a pretty significantly low limited range because they are less powerful. They can actually still make it out to the repeaters. And if we take a look at our picture again, you'll see how all of this works. So our portable radio, as long as we are close to some form of antenna, we will be able to communicate with our dispatch base station in the console in dispatch, because the message gets picked up and sent on down the line until it eventually hits another repeater and hits another repeater and gets close to where our base station lives. And as soon as that happens, the message will actually be received wherever it is that we are sending it from. Repeaters just pick up the low power signal and magnify it and send it on down the line. So we don't have to always be sort of right next door. They're not like, the walkie-talkies you buy at Christmas time as a gift. These are actual pretty heavy duty pieces of equipment. If you've ever, for one reason or another, looked at how expensive even just a little portable radio is, you would probably be astounded by how much those things actually cost. Now we've made it to the 21st century, because radio communications is, for the most part, an older way of doing things. Now in our trucks, we have a mobile data terminal. We have a laptop computer that gives us all of our information. We'll monitor our dispatch times. We can actually communicate with dispatch on this to let them know when we have arrived at the scene, when we are actually transporting our patient, when we have arrived at the hospital, or when we are clear and available for service again. These are great. It makes some of the guesswork of actually keeping on task with our paperwork and getting everything correct a whole lot easier, because as long as we are entering good data in, we'll get good data back. So whoever is sending a message, that is the encoder. They will send this message out digitally, using radio equipment. It breaks down the information into sound waves and digital codes, and it hits the mobile data terminal in your truck and gets decoded in the blink of an eye. It is really kind of next level type stuff, and it makes our life a whole bunch easier. And when all else fails, pull out your cell phone and you can reach out and talk to anybody you want. It's great. There's typically not a lot of waiting and thought involved when it comes time to use your cell phone at work. Cell phones will work almost anywhere and everywhere now. There were times when they were brand new pieces of equipment that, number one, they were expensive and not everybody had them, and number two, um, they weren't as reliable as they are today. The benefit to using your phone, it's easy. You have good sound quality. You don't generally get into spots where terrain affects your ability to use your cell phone. Some disadvantages to using your phone on a call. Sometimes we're involved in things that are gross. And if you're not paying attention, you may have something gross on you or on your gloves. And if you look at this picture right here, she is still gloved up, holding her cell phone millimeters from her face. And it's entirely possible that she is getting smudge all over her phone and all over her person. You know, we talk PPE and, you know, keeping things that are gross and wet and sticky and not belonging to us off of our person. It's a pretty easy mistake to make, to think, oh, I got to get a hold of medical control. This patient's sick. And you reach down, pick up your phone, and there's, you know, blood all over your gloves, or your patient's vomited, and now, you know, you're wiping that all over your phone, all over your uniform. So one of the big disadvantages is you could get something yucky on your phone, you could get something yucky on your person, or you could break your own personal cell phone. One of the other big disadvantages to using a cell phone, Malachi and I were joking about, you know, nurses calling and yelling, or the telephone ringing nonstop in the communication center. That is an absolute fact. That phone rings off the hook 24/7. Cell phone's great, convenient, it's fast. But how many telephone calls on a day-to-day basis do you think the communication center here at Cataldo Ambulance gets? Just
About
ballpark figure. I mean, you think it's a lot or a little?
about 4 to 500 or excess.
Yeah,
In with 911 calls, and then the hospitals and the facilities calling, about 4 to 500.
400 to 500 in a 24-hour period. So that's, you know, that's a pretty significant number. That's a lot. And that's on top of all the other things that the communication people have to answer, and the radio transmissions that they have to pick up, and the other things that go along with doing that job. So sometimes using a cell phone to try and communicate with dispatch is just impractical. Oops. Getting button happy again. So let's talk some ground rules for radio communication. First and foremost, if we want anybody to hear us, we have to make sure that we're on the right frequency. If we're not on the right frequency, our message is not going to get to the people that we're trying to send it to. Number two on the list of important things is listen before transmitting. We all operate on the exact same radio frequency, so every ambulance that's out there on the road right now is talking on the same channel. It is possible that if we don't listen before we start talking, we will actually interrupt someone's transmission, and it could be important. It could be somebody on scene screaming for help because their patient has a gun or has a knife. So pay attention to what's going on before you just key up your microphone and start talking. When you push the radio button to talk on your radio channel, pause for a second. Don't just press the button and start talking. There's a brief delay when it comes to the operation of the radio, so wait a full breath before you start speaking. Speak with your lips about 2 to 3 inches away from the microphone. When people hold the microphone right up to their face, it sounds more like they're trying to eat something than it actually sounds like words are coming out of them. So you don't have to yell into a microphone on a radio, and you don't have to have it like inside your mouth. Just talk in a normal volume and have the radio close to you, but it doesn't have to be, you're not consuming it. Address who you're looking for by name. Ambulance Cataldo Dispatch, this is ambulance 31, or whatever the SOP here is. You're calling to the person that you're looking for. So you are calling Cataldo Dispatch and you are ambulance 31. So identify who you're trying to talk to by name, identify who you are by name. And then wait a second. They'll respond to you. And they'll tell you, go ahead or stand by. Keep transmissions brief. Remember, everyone is on the same channel. So we're not looking for news, weather, and sports on the radio. What we want to know is what you have for information that needs to be conveyed. So as much as it's keep your thoughts and transmissions brief, have an idea of what you want to say before you go live on the microphone. Taking a whole bunch of time with your finger still pressing the push to talk button on the radio to think and hash things out sort of in your own mind is not doing anyone any bit of service. Say numerical digits as you see them. Instead of saying 30, say 30, because it's very easy to mix up in radio transmission numbers and things like that. That's why you use phonetics if you're spelling something out, like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, those kind of things. Do the same with numbers, because if you were ambulance 30 and they thought they heard 13 and you were in ambulance 30 and in trouble, your ambulance was on fire, had just been involved in a crash, and you needed help right away, you don't want them to have to figure out, did they mean 30 or 13? Take it easy and just get your message out and get it out as quickly as you can. We always want to try and avoid diagnosing a patient's problem over the air. The echo method is reading things back. So when you get information, you give information. So dispatch will tell you something. And the only way to confirm that you heard it all appropriately would be to actually repeat it back to them. That is the echo method. Always, 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 I keep a scratch pad or a piece of paper next to me pretty much at all times when I'm at work. If information is important, write it down. No personal information or profanity on the air. Personal information, you're in violation of HIPAA. Profanity, you are violating FCC rules, and both you and Cataldo Ambulance could receive a pretty significant fine for it, and they can pull our license to operate on the radio. Use we terminology, not I. Don't just say yes and no, use affirmative, negative, and the only way to know when a transmission is finished is, to end the transmission with over, received, affirmative, negative, something like that. We have to know that the conversation has ended. So there's an old adage when it comes to public safety and emergency services that says two people always need to know where you are, and that's dispatch and God. And if dispatch doesn't know where you are, prepare to meet the other one. I can't send you help if I don't know where you are and what you're doing. So there has to be two-way communication, and it has to be a back and forth. Always, always, always acknowledge dispatch. I will never, if I ever happen to wind up on the opposite side of the radio from you guys, I'll never ignore you if you are calling me. Regardless of what I'm doing at the time, you will get a response from me. I promise you this, because I don't know what you need. I don't know why you're calling. This could be something very, very important. There's no time to take a break. Um, Always tell dispatch when you're en route to the call. These are times that are going to wind up on your patient care report: when you were dispatched, when you were en route, when you arrived on scene, when you left the scene and were transporting the patient, when you get to the hospital, and when you've cleared the hospital. These are all things that are not only mandatory, but it helps me keep track of where my units are so I don't lose somebody, or so I don't wind up getting somebody hurt because, well, they've been stuck on scene with a violent patient for a while and I haven't checked on them because, well, I still had them en route because either they never called or I never heard them. So just be sure that communication is really working the way that it's supposed to. When we're talking with medical control, I know we went over this a little bit. These are the things that they want from us. They're really looking for a very clear and concise vision of what we have in front of us, because they're not there. So they're relying on us to give them good information. Unit and level. That means who you are and what level of care you are certified to provide. So Cataldo Ambulance 30 or Cataldo BLS Ambulance 30. So that way they know they are talking to BLS providers from Cataldo and it's in Ambulance 30. They want the patient's age and sex and chief complaint. So 42-year-old male complaining of chest pain. Very, very to the point, very direct. The history of their present illness is what's going on right now. You know, tell them what your assessment findings are. Give them a brief past medical history. They don't care that, you know, your 42-year-old patient had their tonsils out in 1982. What they do care about is your 42-year-old patient that's complaining of chest pain had a heart attack last month. They're gonna want to know your patient's mental status. That's going to tell them some things about the patient's condition when we mix all of these things together. So they're really looking for very concise, very abbreviated sort of patient care report. Medical control gives you an order. Repeat that order back to them word for word. If they told you something that doesn't make sense or is just so far out of the realm of things that you think is okay for you to do, question it. Don't be afraid, because first of all, who do you think answers the medical control telephone? And don't say a doctor.
Nurse.
It is a doctor, but do you think it is like the head of the emergency department for partners? You
No,
know, do you
probably
think it's
not
like the
us.
chief of medicine?
No.
No, really, who answers the telephone at medical control most of the time is what we like to refer to as a docling. It is a doctor who is learning to be a doctor in the ER. So they might not always be super familiar with what it is that we do, how we do it, what we're able to do. They may not know the difference between ALS and BLS at that very given moment in time. So they might tell you something that if you were a paramedic would make a ton of sense. But since you're a BLS level ambulance, they'll tell you, well, I need you to establish an IV, intubate the patient, and give 300 milligrams of amiodarone. And you'll go, Doc, I'm not sure you heard me correctly. This is Cataldo BLS 30. And then they'll, oh, okay, BLS ambulance. Instead, just work cardiac arrest en route and defibrillate as directed by the AED. All right, perfect. That's just what we were looking for. So this is pretty much how we get all of that information that they were looking for at medical control, broken down into bite-sized chunks so that we can have some effective communication with medical control. The mnemonic is SBLAR. It is situation, background, assessment, and recommendation. And this is what it sounds like when it's done appropriately. Dr. White, I have a 56-year-old male patient complaining of chest discomfort. That situation. Has a history of previous MI with a stent. His pain, which is typical of his previous MI, began 50 minutes ago. He experienced no relief following nitroglycerin administration. He was given 180 milligrams of aspirin. There's our background. He is anxious and alert. His blood pressure is 168/98. Heart rate is 108. There's my assessment. Now my recommendation. I would like to administer another nitroglycerin spray. Now, if I had just read that straight through, it would have taken me 45 seconds maybe. I have gotten all the important information front loaded to this doctor. And then I tell him, all right, I want to go ahead and try another nitroglycerin spray. He's either going to say yes or no, but he's got no room to complain about what I told him or how I told it to him, because I gave him everything he could possibly need to make his decision. Because at the end of it, if he tells me to give the patient more nitro and I give the patient more nitro when it goes bad, they're the one who made that decision. We were just following our orders. We are going to give almost the exact same information over the radio to the receiving facility, because every patient, when we go into the emergency room, you need to contact the receiving facility. They need to know that you're coming. But they're really looking for age, sex, chief complaint, and a brief rundown of what's going on. They don't want the patient's entire chart. They don't want the patient's entire medical history, starting from when they had their tonsils out at the age of 9. Everything is brief, because what are you going to do when you get to that emergency room?
You're gonna give more details and to the admit nurse, and then they decide where the patient goes, whether it's trauma or whatever part of the hospital the patients go. But you give them a more detailed description as to what's going on.
Yeah, spot on. We have to do this. This is where we make sure we don't abandon the patient. So they want to know a brief rundown of what's going on out in the street, because they want to make sure they have the hands available in the emergency room when we get there. Because when we get there, we're going to give that detailed report. We're going to give that handoff so we don't abandon our patient. We're going to talk to the person or people who are going to be responsible for this patient's care. And we are going to communicate anything and everything that this patient has told us and what we have done and how things are going right this very second when we get there. So we don't have to, again, get on the radio and give news, weather, and sports. We give them a very brief synopsis of how things are going and what we are doing.
To speak to what you were saying earlier with that case in New Jersey versus what we just spoke about, would it be fair to say that when you call medical control, when you say they made that decision, as long as that whatever they're telling you is within the realms of your I forgot what the phrase is, the term you use, but your ability to what you're allowed to
Your
practice.
scope of practice and standard of care.
Right, your scope of practice and standard of care. So you just have to do you have to assess what they're telling you and say, hey, this is not like, for instance, you say ALS versus BLS. So let's say it's within your scope of practice and standard of care. Are they then liable if things go bad?
No, still, if you do something that's outside of your scope of practice, you are the person responsible for it.
But no, but if it's inside, like if it's something that you're allowed to do, but your doctor, they give a wrong recommendation. You're allowed to do it, but they give a wrong recommendation.
So there's probably enough blame in a situation like that to go around, to be honest with you, because
Right.
we should know sort of, and you got, this will make a lot more sense when we get into some of the actual medical problems, and when we start talking about the BLS drugs and things that we're allowed to give, when we're responsible for knowing when those medicines should be administered versus when those medicines shouldn't be administered. And just because the doctor tells us, yeah, go ahead and try this, if you think it's wrong, ask, because you're far better off, getting enough information to make an informed clinical decision and do something to or for a patient, rather than sort of just blindly following a doctor's order and then having everything go amok.
So is it fair to say medical control is just there to kind of kind of just to bounce off what you're doing to make sure that you're going in the right direction, kind of a
Yep.
like
Yeah, and
distance.
it's most useful. So there's certain times, like we'll talk epinephrine here for a minute. Epinephrine is a medicine that we use to treat a patient who's in anaphylactic shock. It is very easy to identify. It is something that really is difficult to miss. Epinephrine is also a very potent, very powerful drug that acts on all of your vasculature, so all of your blood vessels. It speeds up your heart. It raises your blood pressure. It does a whole lot of cardiovascular things. And if a patient is over the age of 65, before we give epinephrine, we have to call medical control, because we're worried about the stability of their cardiovascular system. We're worried about, is this medicine now going to solve their anaphylaxis but cause them to have a stroke or a heart attack? So we would call medical control and discuss that with them, and they would tell us what to do. If your patient is under the age of 65, we would go ahead and give epinephrine. It wouldn't matter, because we would know that at the age of 65 is generally when cardiovascular problems really start to mount and get worse, and we would be concerned about giving epinephrine to that person. But someone who is younger than the age of 65, it is less likely to have a negative outcome to give them an EpiPen in an anaphylaxis situation, because their cardiovascular system is much healthier. So we don't have to call medical control for that. So there are times where, yes, we absolutely have to call them. There are times when, calling them is just to make sure, like you said, that we are heading down the right path.
Roger.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did.
All right, good. All right, so folks, that is it for lecture. What do we think? Is anybody terribly, horribly confused, or did anyone fall asleep?
No.
No.
Everybody out there still alive?
Yes.
All right. Things get more interesting from here. Medical legal is not, and communications also, like talking about how radios work, is not exactly the most exhilarating conversation to have it starting at 8:30 in the morning, and I get it. But we got to build from the ground up, right?
Right.
So here we go. We have completed our first series of lectures this morning. I will see you all at 1 o'clock, and we'll come in and do some skills.
Ready. Thank you so
Roger.
much.
All right,
See you
talk to you
later.
all soon.